Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Nearly a year has passed since the horrific attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel, the single deadliest attack in the country's history. Over 1,250 Israelis and foreign nationals were killed, and around 250 individuals were abducted and taken into Gaza. A few days ago, we learned the heartbreaking news of the killing of 6 Israeli hostages, whose bodies were recovered by the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza. I would like to extend my deepest condolences to the bereaved families. I met the loved ones of several hostages last November in Jerusalem, including the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poet. I watched the shocking and heartbreaking video footage of his capture, images I will never forget. According to the Israeli government, the hostages had been shot multiple times at close range. They were killed by Hamas shortly before Israeli soldiers were able to reach them inside a tunnel in Rafah. Following the recovery of the bodies, Hamas announced that militants guarding hostages in buildings and tunnels of Gaza had new instructions to kill hostages before they could be recovered alive by Israeli forces. At least 101 hostages are still held in Gaza. They are still denied humanitarian visits. Accounts of released hostages and other reports indicate they are likely being held in horrific conditions, with some being subject to violence, including sexual violence and other forms of abuse. I echo the words of the Secretary General once again. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. For as long as they are held, in accordance with international legal obligations, they must be treated humanely and allowed to receive visits and assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Mr. President, we need an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza. I welcome the continued efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States in this regard. Recent meetings in Doha and Cairo attempted to bridge gaps, but major differences persist. More must be done to reach a deal without further delay. The United Nations remains committed to supporting all efforts to this end. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground looks grim. Israeli military operations continue across Gaza, and the number of fatalities tragically keeps increasing. According to the Gaza Ministry of Health, since 7 October, some 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, a majority of whom were reportedly women and children. We continue to witness mass displacement of thousands of Palestinian families, most unable to access medical services, water, and sanitation. Many families have been displaced several times. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. At the same time, the indiscriminate launching of rockets by Hamas and other armed groups toward population centers in Israel also continues. Civilian objects in Gaza, including infrastructure, are also reportedly being used to shield fighters and military objectives, endangering the lives of civilians in and around them. Civilians should not, must not be used as human shields. Humanitarian access is tenuous at best, jeopardized by unsafe conditions, including a complete breakdown of law and order throughout Gaza. The 27 August security incident involving a World Food Program humanitarian convoy forced the agency to temporarily suspend the movement of its staff. My colleague, Director Osorno from OCHA, will shortly brief you further on the catastrophic humanitarian situation and the agonizing conditions faced by humanitarian workers. Also, the Secretary General has been following closely the polio immunization campaign currently underway in Gaza. The images of young children receiving their vaccinations amid rubble and utter ruin are both moving and distressing. The polio pauses are a rare hope and humanity, a rare ray of hope and humanity amid the horror in Gaza. I note that the arrangements established between the UN agencies and the IDF to pause military activity in the designated vaccination areas have so far been respected. Like the Secretary General, I commend all those involved in this undertaking, especially our extraordinary humanitarian colleagues leading the campaign. Mr. President, while we continue to focus on ending the killing and destruction in Gaza, we cannot lose sight of the alarming situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. This includes Israeli military operations, settler attacks, and armed Palestinian violence against Israelis. Most recently, Israel launched on 28 August large-scale military operations against alleged terrorist cells in Jenin, Tulkarm, and Tubas governorates. The operations also involved the use of airstrikes. These intensive and week-long operations resulted in clashes with armed Palestinians, civilian casualties, and damage to civilian infrastructure. The operations were launched amid an uptick in attacks and clashes throughout the occupied West Bank, including in the Hebron area, with 2 car bombs near Israeli settlements the night of 30 August, the killing of 3 Israeli police officers in their car the following day, and a subsequent Israeli military operation in the area. Overall, since 7 October, some 630 Palestinians and 15 Israelis have been killed in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. All perpetrators of violence, Israeli or Palestinian, must be held accountable. Recent dangerous and provocative acts and statements are further inflaming the situation. Statements by Palestinian armed groups calling for further violence and attacks against Israelis are unacceptable and must cease. The recent inflammatory acts and statements by an Israeli minister at the holy sites in Jerusalem add to an already explosive situation in the occupied West Bank. And the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem must be respected and upheld, recognizing the special and historic role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan as custodian of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Mr. President, with every passing day, we get further away from the objective of ending the occupation and achieving a viable 2-state solution. We remain convinced that durable peace will only be achieved when Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state live side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. It is our responsibility to do all we can to support the parties in reaching that objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Eden